Alright, what's up everybody? So there is something I see pretty regularly in the fitness industry, just in the lifting community overall, and it's that very few lifters actually make it to the advanced or the elite stage. Oftentimes this is kind of implied that it's a genetic thing, and I'm not going to act like genetics aren't a variable, because they absolutely are, and a lot of those top guys on the world-class bodybuilding stages that are winning those shows, they are fairly gifted, but the amount of muscle mass that they have isn't that far out of reach for the vast majority of people. And I think unless you have like severe genetic deficiencies in terms of bodybuilding, I don't think these advanced level physiques are unrealistic for most people in terms of overall muscle mass. Of course, the shape, the muscle belly size, the insertions, all that kind of stuff is going to be different from person to person, and some will look more appealing to bodybuilding judges than other. But in terms of like overall mass you can build, FFMI, all that kind of stuff, I think a lot of people are unknowingly holding themselves back. And the main reason I think this is because not many people talk about the fact that when you train as a beginner with a beginner's level understanding of lifting, and you do that properly, what happens? You end up making progress, and eventually that progress starts to kind of slow down, and a lot of these people run into a plateau. And what happens is you get these people that are intermediates, so they're beginners that successfully trained, became an intermediate, and almost got a little bit too attached to the methods they were using. They almost overrate their own understanding of lifting as a whole. They kind of overrate themselves, and they kind of think that they can't get to that next level because their genetics aren't good enough, or because everybody else is a fake natty and you can't trust anybody, and anyone that competes as a high-level natural bodybuilder or as a big natural fitness influencer has all these weird motives to be a fake natty, and they think they know everything, and they just can't get to that same level because either they have bad genetics, or everybody else is great at genetics, or they're just on gear or something. And I think when you look at this as a whole, a lot of these intermediate lifters are really just beginners with an intermediate physique. Because in reality, what is an intermediate lifter? Well, it's a beginner that did the beginner phase properly, and then you just end up as an intermediate because that means you did the beginner phase. So when you see an intermediate lifter, it's not necessarily that their understanding of lifting or their ability to lift hard or lift properly is at that like intermediate stage. A lot of the times, these are just beginner lifters that are at the end of the beginner stage, aka they are an intermediate. So it might sound kind of nitpicky, but I do think that's a very real thing. And I think once you see kind of those rapid beginner gains, it's very easy to almost get too caught up in those specific systems, that way of lifting, and you think you know everything, you think that's the only way to do it. That plateau hits these people hard, and rather than like looking inwards and saying, you know what, I might not know as much as I thought I did, and kind of like being humble about it and pointing the finger inwards, it's very easy to just kind of point the finger outward and say, well, the standards are incorrect, or these people are fake natties, the drug testing isn't good enough, genetics, like all those kind of little excuses. And it's not that these people have like bad intentions or anything. I think they genuinely believe this, because I used to genuinely believe that I like had bad genetics and everyone else is a fake natty and whatnot. And ultimately it's just not true, especially as you kind of expose yourself to new training methods and you see how to actually make progress that isn't just based around like quick noob gains. And once you start to expose yourself to just viewing how other people lift and being a little bit more open-minded, you can really take your training a lot farther than you think you can. So I have a few things that I see, or a few mistakes that I see intermediates make regularly. I have a couple honorable mentions I'm going to touch on first. I'm not going to go in depth because I don't want to spend the video on these, because I've talked about them before, or they're very straightforward, but either way. The first honorable mention is they are afraid to bulk or cut. Very straightforward. If you're making good gains on a bulk, you get super attached to the bulk, you're afraid to cut and you're afraid to lose your muscle. The reality is, if you cut properly, and when I say properly, like any type of cut within reason, regardless of the rate, as long as it's within reason, you're not really going to lose muscle unless you really mess something up, which is harder to do than you think. People are afraid to bulk because they're too attached to their abs. They think they can just kind of like make those noob gains forever, when in reality you if you want to be at a certain level of body weight, like it has to come from calories. You can't just recomp your way to a heavier body weight. And the next one I would have is they treat a lot of lifts as accessories, and they have a very kind of structured hierarchy within how they view their program. A lot of the times I'll see like a hyper obsession with squat, bench, deadlift, or the big three or variations of that, and then you don't even, in a lot of these programs, you don't even see arm training. And to me, that's just not how you should view bodybuilding, because you can't just be obsessed with a few lifts that train a couple muscles and then leave other muscles completely on the back burner just because they need to take a slightly different programming approach. And people just get a little bit too obsessed with strength, I think. And the last one, people really disregard stability. The more advanced you get, the more important stability becomes. So don't be that guy that's like, oh, you don't need to use machines because you can just get as big as you want with free weights. And I'm not going to say you can't get big with free weights. Like, of course you can. But if you want to be efficient and arguably get more results at least faster, or at least equal results faster, using highly stable lifts, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a machine, it just has to be stable, it is going to be a more efficient way to train, in my opinion. So I see people disregarding stability a little bit too often. Okay, so the first point I already kind of touched on. Let's just go into the next one. So this would be unrealistic progression expectations. And this just comes from, this kind of stems from the fitness industry overcorrecting for a lack of emphasis on progressive overload for so long. What happened, like the fitness industry kind of, it like ebbs and flows in certain ways, and there got to a point where this is a little bit before my time, and this is why I got so caught up in progressive overload, is because I came into the industry when that was just being like overcorrected to the extreme. But from what I can tell, kind of before my time in lifting in the fitness industry, people used to focus a lot on like time under tension and the pump and the burn and muscle damage and all this kind of stuff. And it would be like a very kind of like intuitive style of training, and they would just focus on like getting a pump and beating down their muscle the most they can without really focusing on progressive overload. And instead of saying, well, if you are building muscle, like progressive overload should be an outcome of that, they said it eventually kind of turned into the basically the saying that progressive overload causes hypertrophy, when in reality it's the other way around. And I'm not saying that progressive overload isn't going to be a necessary observation within your own training. People are just viewing it completely backwards. And the problem is it kind of went from one extreme to the other, to where when I was getting into lifting, and by the time I was in my second or third year of lifting, I had nearly ditched any lift that I couldn't like quote unquote progressively overload because it wouldn't drive growth. So I would heavily bias lifts like the squat, bench, deadlift. Technique wouldn't matter at all because like I said, progressive overload drives hypertrophy. So you can kind of see how you can slowly like snowball into this, into basically becoming a power lifter. And you might say that's like a kind of a slippery slope argument, but I think I'm the perfect living example of that. And I know it's not just me, because when I started the channel talking about these things, I said, I don't know how many people can relate to me out there. And then sure enough, my channel started to gain traction pretty quickly, because there were a lot of other intermediate lifters stuck in the same exact ways that I was, because we were a product of the fitness industry telling us that progressive overload is the most important factor for not just assessing your rate of growth, but actually causing and driving muscle growth, which just isn't true. So that's definitely an issue. And when it comes to progressive overload, these same people that talk about how you always have to see progression and you have to one-up every session in order to drive growth, or it's a bad session or a wasted session, I think we found a nice happy medium, I think, overall in the fitness community as a whole with this approach. But nobody talks about the rate at which progressive overload should occur. And the reason for that is because you can't talk about that to an entire community, because it's lift dependent, it's lifter dependent, it's training age dependent. Like you just can't like say, all right, we'll gain a rep every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks or like once every month or whatever. So actually, well, okay, I know 4 weeks in the month are the same thing. So what I would say to you guys is feel free to just go on like a rep max calculator and just plug in some numbers, just play around with it. And a lot of the times these won't have you put in a specific lift, but you can put the numbers of certain lifts in. So let's say you are preacher curling 75 pounds for 5 reps. see what your projected 1 rep max is. And your 1 rep max is irrelevant, but it's just to give you kind of a sense of what your progression looks like as a total weight added to the bar in 1 rep, and how that correlates to your rep progression as a whole. So if you were to say, let's take my 5 rep max preacher curl, say your projected 1 rep max is 90 pounds, if you can do 75 for 5. If you get your 5 rep max with 75 to say 6 reps, what's your projected 1 rep max now? What about 7 reps? What about 8, 9, 10, etc.? And more often than not, you'll realize that just adding a handful of reps to a specific lift increases your 1 rep max specifically. And you might be saying, what's the point of your 1 rep max for bodybuilding? That doesn't actually matter. And it's just to give you perspective to like how much adding 1 rep to your top set of a certain lift actually does in terms of your overall progression as a whole. And you don't even need like the general strength standards or anything for this. You can just look at like what's like a reasonable weight that a lot of bodybuilders are using. And it's not a weight that you should chase. It's just to say like, all right, well, if I see this bodybuilder on Instagram and he's, say, deadlifting 455 for a set of 8, and I'm doing 355 for 8, how many reps do I need to add to get my my 1 rep max to what his projected 1 rep max would be, or to get my 5 rep max to his 5 rep max, or his 8 rep to, or my 8 rep max to his 8 rep max, for example. You can just look at these calculators and it will basically, you can just plug in the numbers and look at what your projected 1 rep max, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 rep maxes are. After 10 reps, it gets a little bit blurry, so some calculators don't even do it. You can mess around with multiple calculators if you want. The one I use is just the 1 rep max calculator on calculator.net, and it will just kind of show you like, all right, if you literally just add, say, like 1 rep every quarter, so like every 3 months, if you were to add a rep, you would still add a pretty notable amount of weight to your 1 rep max on a given lift across an entire year. And I think that just helps give you a realistic rate of progression. And I'm not saying that's exactly how it works. It is a little bit more nuanced than that, especially as you're adding in like weight incremental jumps between just adding reps to a specific lift. But that can help give you kind of a realistic time frame for what you'll see as far as progression goes. And it can't predict everything, but what you'll find is that the rate at which you add reps will seem slow, but the amount that increases your 1 rep max will seem higher than you think it would. So it kind of tells you that you almost expect your reps to add super fast, but then you're surprised at how much strength you actually gain from adding reps to at a rate that seems slow from what the fitness industry standards kind of are. So that can just help give you a more realistic gauge of progress. Next point is there's a Barbell Apparel free hoodie sale, and you can get a free hoodie with any order over $99, and you can stack them as much as you want. There's a bunch of new designs they have out. They sent me a couple. They're absolutely sweet, really cool to train in, and I love them. So I'll if I remember, I'll put up a display of all of their hoodies, and yeah, like I said, any order over $99, you'll get a free hoodie with it. You can stack them too, so if you spend, say, $200, you can get 2 free hoodies, $300 for 3 free hoodies, etc. And while you're at it, if you like the flannels, those are perfect. I absolutely love these, as I talked about a couple videos ago. Their new Frontier flannels are sweet. That's what I'm wearing right now. And yeah, check out. You can check out the link in my description. You'll see my collection of all my Barbell Apparel stuff. And then the next issue I see is an over-obsession with weekly volume. Volume's a tough one because it would be so much easier to program if volume was what we thought it was or what we wanted it to be. So the tricky thing with volume is you just simply can't reverse engineer it. So it sounds so great to hear like, oh, just do 10 to 20 sets a week for every muscle group and you'll be fine. But the problem is to make an optimal program and to see optimal growth and just to, I'll expand on that in a second here. But you can't just be reverse engineering your volume. It has to be the other way around. So you have to make your program, pick your frequency, pick your lifts first, and then your volume is more so an outcome of what your program actually is. You don't want to build it the other way around, because I'll give an example here. So let's say you're taking that 10 to 20 sets a week recommendation, and the recent science has shown that 40 sets a week is optimal, and you'll see faster growth at 40 sets a week. So you're somewhat reasonable. You say, all right, I'll go to the higher end of that volume range. So maybe you're aiming for 18 or 20 sets a week. To keep it simple, let's say you pick 20 sets a week, and your frequency is twice a week because you're following, say, upper, lower, or push-pull legs, repeat. If you're doing a split like that, let's say you're like, all right, twice a week frequency, I need to hit 20 sets a week to see the maximum growth I can while still being able to recover. What lifts are you going to pick? If you have to do 10 sets of, say, quads per session, or really any muscle group, but let's say quads just for this example. If you have to do 10 sets in a session, are these going to be highly potent lifts with very high effort that you need to grow as an intermediate lifter? Probably not. Like if you have to do 10 sets, if I had to do like a leg day and train my quads, I would do some hack squats, some pendulum squats, and then maybe leg extensions. That's like on paper the perfect optimal way to train quads at twice a week if they're like a higher priority as like a kind of a plateaued, maybe late intermediate lifter, or just intermediate lifter in general. So let's say that's the ideal, perfect way to train your quads. Well, now why do you have to do 10 sets in that session? So now you're just arbitrarily bumping up your volume. And let's say, okay, so if you have to hit that number of 10 sets in a session, so all right, 4 sets on hack squats, 4 sets on, say, pendulum squats, and then 2 sets on leg extensions after that, like, okay, by the time you get to your final sets on hack squats, you're already going to be fried. And that's just one movement pattern that you're training. And then you move on to leg extension, and you get a little bit of different stimulus from just hitting a different angle, hitting a different depth, having a different resistance profile, having other muscles start to contribute or contribute less based on the variation. Where is that energy coming from? It's going to be a lot of low quality work. And then by the time you get to your leg extensions, would it be better to train something that has its own benefits like a leg extension does when you've already done 8 sets of like squat patterns? Or do you think you'll get better all around growth from doing 1 or 2 sets on each and doing 3 different variations and being able to train leg extensions, say, by your 4th or 5th set of the session rather than like your 9th or 10th set of the session? So that's the main issue with it, is even in terms of like maximizing one specific muscle group, it's less than ideal, because by the time you get to those final variations, it's like just erase half of what you were doing before, still keep the variations in if you want to be optimal, but you're just adding more and more fatigue for no extra benefit because you already got the benefits of that lift in your first and second set, assuming that you actually trained them hard, and now you're less fatigued overall by the time you get to your second and or third variation in that given session. Another issue with this is it does lead to junk volume, which is obvious, and at first glance it's like, junk volume, like who cares? I don't mind staying a little late in the gym if I'm wasting an extra 20 minutes and it doesn't really negatively or positively impact me. I just kind of view it as like an insurance policy to make sure I got everything I could. And it's like, at face value, that makes a lot of sense, but when you actually look into it, junk volume takes away important slots in your training program, especially as you become stronger as an intermediate lifter. When you're a beginner, you have a lot more room for error, but once you're an intermediate lifter, you are now losing important slots. Like, if you are just like doing all this work and doing all these sets, that's just so much focus and energy and time put into a lot of redundancy, when in reality your physique and our bodies are fairly complex, and I would much rather see somebody get good variation, or at least kind of have more muscles work as a prime mover in a lift, than just to spam volume for the sake of hitting an arbitrary weekly volume number. So this could take away like kind of precious time and energy from, like, say, working the calves or the forearms, or like rear delt isolation work, side delt isolation work, having variety for training like the triceps long head versus the lateral head. Like, those are things that will ultimately make a difference in your physique, but hitting that arbitrary weekly volume number, I just think it's completely overrated. So that's that point. The next one that I have is that a lot of intermediate lifters are afraid of technique resets. And this one, it's funny because it sounds so ridiculous when you say it out loud, but it's very easy to get trapped in this philosophy. So a lot of lifters get attached to their strength numbers because they're obsessed with progressive overload and they have progressive overload anxiety. And the problem with this is when you are taking a technique reset, you have to decrease the weight on the lift that you're doing, unless it's very minor. Of course, there are cases where you can just clean up your technique and kind of maintain performance and just go about it that way. But in a lot of cases, if you need like a legit technique reset to where you're like plateaued on a lift and you're not getting adequate stimulus from it, that's a different story. And that is much more common than most people think. And the problem I see is people see technique resets as a weight regression and you're losing progress, and it's proof that like your most recent 4 months of training where you worked up to that weight were all just for nothing. And the problem is that's not true, because a lot of the time as we progress, our technique has to degrade to some degree. It's just a matter of knowing when it's appropriate to reset your technique and go back to something a little bit, not necessarily more strict, but something a lot more precise. And the approach that I like to take that pretty much just gets this technique reset to be appealing or to click for most lifters is to view it as a lift rotation. So if you were doing, say, like cheat reps on a specific lift, like when I do preacher curls, when I built up to my 18-inch arms, I would use less strict technique. It was still overall pretty strict, but I would lift my butt up off the seat a little bit or put the seat a little bit higher, I don't even remember. And I wouldn't quite lock out, and I would lean forwards just a tad to get a little bit of momentum. And I built up to a pretty respectable strength number on that. But when I switched my technique to something a lot more strict, I had to remove weight off the bar by a pretty decent margin, because it's not because my strength was fake or anything, it's just a different lift. It's like, just because it's the same movement pattern, the technique that you use can change the lift drastically. So whether, like, I guess the way I would summarize it is, don't view a movement pattern as a lift and the technique as just how strong you are. Think of like a strict version and a cheat version as two different things, and that will make a technique reset a little bit more palatable. And ultimately, it's just important to realize that when you have good, precise technique and you're using less weight, the strength that you had before was kind of artificial because you were just using cheat that would allow you to move more weight. So technique resets, they're entirely necessary and they're completely normal too. No matter how good your technique actually is, it's very normal to see your technique degrade over time, especially as you're trying to witness progressive overload happen in your training. So there's no problem with it at all. If you're never having to reset your technique or anything, you either probably have built up pretty bad technique without realizing it, or you're just not training hard enough in the first place, or at least not being as assertive and aggressive as you should be with adding weight to your lifts. That's pretty much all I have to say there. So a strict version and a cheat version of the same lift, in my eyes, those are two very different lifts. The next one I have is you are still following fitness influencers. And I don't necessarily have a problem with following fitness influencers, but it's more of an issue of taking them a lot more seriously than you should, because a lot of fitness influencers aren't as good of lifters as you think they are, and they aren't even, most of the time they aren't lifters as a primary thing. Lifting is very much secondary to just content creation in general. These are people that, generally speaking, are seeking validation, and lifting is just the avenue they chose to take to seek that specific validation. So lifting is very much secondary. They'll kind of do what they can to get by. They'll do whatever they can to take crazy pictures and meet the algorithm's desires, and that's ultimately what they're after. And you might be saying, well, if someone's chasing the craziest physique possible just to meet the algorithm, like, why does it matter what their actual desire is? And I would say, if that was the case, yeah, it doesn't really matter that much, aside from, like, maybe they're more prone to taking PEDs and lying about it, but we all know how that works in the fitness industry. I would say, though, that you aren't required to have as great of a physique when manipulating your pictures is as easy as it is, and when you're as good at it as these guys are. It's not necessarily just your classic Photoshop. A lot of the time it's like the angles, the pump, the lighting, how lean they are, which automatically holds back their physique and prevents them from progressing and realizing how you should train as an advanced lifter. A lot of the time these are just like shredded intermediates, and to go full circle here, yeah, a lot of intermediate lifters don't actually know that much about lifting, and I think that's why so many fitness influencers are seemingly kind of dumb when it comes to lifting, when you wouldn't really assume that. So that's how I see it. They definitely put being a content creator first, and lifting is very much secondary. I would suggest to follow people that are either fitness educators or lifters first, and make content just because they're obsessed with lifting. So probably someone like myself. I'm not saying I'm like the best person out there to follow or the best lifter out there, obviously, but I do think it's important to listen to people's takes that actually put lifting first, and I try and show that is who I am, and you can trust me with that. So that's my experience with fitness influencers, and I would say just follow bodybuilders instead, because those guys will still make content, but it's more so just to like log their training, and you'll notice that their posts and their captions and the way they approach social media is very much like they genuinely just do it for themselves, and they talk about their training, their approach, their mindset, and they don't care at all about getting followers. Like, they'll still post like the regular like swipe through each clip to watch their entire workout, which is not going to be appealing. It's not going to be the best angles. It's not going to be the best lighting. It's not going to be reels. It's not going to be on TikTok. Like, all those little things to just kind of meet the algorithm. It's not going to be doing a trend just for the sake of doing a trend, just to try and get followers and likes and views from it. Following actual bodybuilders that put their training first and have to hold themselves accountable by literally getting on stage, you'll realize it's a completely different game than like what the influencers are doing in the gym. And obviously, not all of us can directly relate to like a competitive natural bodybuilder, because they are generally training a little bit differently, at least year round, because obviously you don't need to train the same way they do when they're in like close proximity to stage leanness, when they have to like really obsess over stimulus to fatigue and the weight they're using and all that kind of stuff. But to watch how those guys bulk, especially the ones that do bulk up in the off season, those guys will teach you so much more just by observing them than any fitness influencer could, that just kind of regurgitates garbage from whatever is trending in the fitness industry at the moment. The last one I have is just overall, one of the biggest issues I see is just being too minimalist. And there definitely are appropriate times where you should seek to kill two birds with one stone. But if that's your approach to your entire program and your training as a whole, then you're definitely going to be leaving gains on the table. So an example of where this is kind of appropriate to be like quote-unquote minimalist, and it's not, minimalist would be the philosophy as a whole. This would just be seeking to kill two birds with one stone, or at least just be a little bit more efficient with your training. Is, let's say you're doing a leg press, and you want to leave open slots in your leg training to train, say, like your rear delts or your traps or your calves or something. Instead of like doing your quad work and then you say like adductor work and like hamstring work and all that, what you could do is just kind of pick a variation for your quads that also hits your adductors a little bit. So like when I do my leg press, I'll usually do 2 sets of like a moderate height, slightly wider stance, and that's in there to train my quads, but those 2 sets hit the adductors pretty well, so I don't have to like isolate my adductors later on in that session and take away spots from something that would be a higher priority. So I can kind of kill 2 birds with one stone just by finding a variation that trains another muscle group in with another as like not quite a secondary mover, but somewhere between a primary and a secondary mover, to the point where I can see valuable gains from just doing that lift and not having to like isolate every little muscle in my body. But if you take that approach to everything, where you're someone that's like, yeah, chin-ups are going to train my biceps, and close grip bench and pushing, that's all going to train my triceps for, if I'm doing 1 set of bench, that's half a set for my triceps. And like, if you're a total beginner, you can kind of get away with that just because you can generally see growth just from actually lifting. Like, you're going from not even no stimulus, but like negative stimulus. You're actually atrophying in most cases if you're not training at all over time, very slowly. And just lifting in general is going to at least get you away from that. But once you have those new gains and you're kind of past that, you want to keep variations open and keep slots open in your program so you can train everything. So it's like the guys that say you don't even need to isolate your biceps, just do like your back work should train your biceps to the extent that you need to. Like, No, I'm sorry, I can't get on board with that because your biceps are a secondary mover on any pull, and not even that. They're also biarticular muscles, so it's the same thing as the long head of the tricep on your presses. Like when you row or when you pull, your bicep lengthens on one end and shortens on the other, so it kind of cancels out a lot of the range of motion there, on top of being a secondary mover to your lats or your traps or whatever muscle you're training your back on your pulls. So I'm very much against being minimalist in that regard. But it's more so about seeking out opportunities where it's a little bit more appropriate. Like if you're doing, say, like an RDL, like cool, that's a great lift for the hamstrings and for the spinal erectors. Like that's a good way to kill two birds with one stone. You don't just have to do like a spinal erector isolation lift. You don't just have to do hamstring curls and hamstring isolation lifts. Like that's an efficient way to kill two birds with one stone. But you don't want to take that to your program as a whole and see the least amount you can generally like kind of get away with. Like, and the reason why I say this is because most of us aren't gifted enough to be able to train like a minimalist, and some people are, but that's absolutely the exception and not the rule. Like for myself personally, if I stop isolating my rear delts, no matter how much I'm doing for my lats, no matter how much I'm doing for my traps, I can do all the rows and the pulls that I want. If I stop isolating my rear delts, they slowly start to shrink, and I need to find ways to like add rear delt work into my program, or else I risk them not growing. Not even not growing, just slowly shrinking over time. Like I need to be doing some type of overhead work where I stretch out my long head to be able to actually see sufficient long head growth in my triceps. So being able to be minimalist when you need to is fine, but if that's your approach to your program as a whole, you're 100% going to be leaving gains on the table. It's like sometimes, like at a certain point, muscles are just going to become kind of reluctant to growth, and you really need to like hit them as hard as you can in a very stable and precise way to be able to get them to keep growing past that intermediate stage. So it's very much different than training as a beginner. If you are intermediate and want to become advanced, that's something you do have to take into account, and finding a way to keep your program efficient, limit junk volume without becoming minimalist, and use those opportunities to add variety to the places that need to see some direct work in order to continue growth and have a well-rounded physique. That's exactly what you need to do. So that's all I've got for today. If you have any questions, let me know. If there's also any mistakes that you made as a beginner lifter or that you see other intermediates making, leave it in the comments. I'm always curious to see it, and I think it will help a lot of other people too. I was actually considering putting out like a poll or just kind of like an open Q&A on my Instagram or something, just to see what people would say, but it was a little too last minute before I went down to film. So yeah, let me know what you think. I'll see you guys in the next one.